I'll try to avoid that. I know no such words in English, actually. No. So, Emily, it's really very nice having you here, and thanks for a very nice talk. You're working on dance and cancer, but when I was more being interested in the whole sort of area of dance and brain, I realized that dance is sort of involved in human beings from the cradle to the end of life, more or less. So we know about dance and Parkinson's, for example, but how come that you choose cancer?
Good question, and it was actually for multiple reasons. I actually grew up in a community where cancer became very common. My grandfather, as mentioned, had cancer, and I saw the effects of cancer in him from a very young age. Yeah. So actually my first point of reference to what cancer was visual, and really quite radical changes to his body. And then with that saw significant changes to his quality of life, his spirit, and the way that he interacted with people. And then as a teenager, he passed away, but I also found that in my community, my friend's mother and aunt had cancer, another friend's father had cancer, and it was actually very normalized. And then years later, when I specialized in dance and was always very interested when working with dance as to looking at where it wasn't happening and questioning why. And I was working a lot with projects where it was serving the kind of older adult community or younger people, gifted and talented, or really young people with families, and I felt there was a huge gap of people who could benefit from dance that weren't being served, weren't being given dance opportunities. And then because I had such an interest in health and looking at the way I was facilitating and how people were responding in those dance sessions, I was really curious what is dance doing here? Why is it good? In what ways is it good? So that kind of scientific interest got sparked. And at the same time, even though I was then in my 20s, heard people around me talking about cancer and how there was a real lack of support post-treatment. I actually just talked to a woman now who said that you go through this very intense period of treatment and surgery and quite radical changes in a very concentrated period of time, and you have a lot of attention from your medical team. And then at some point they say, okay, come back in 6 months or a year for a checkup. And it's like the body or the mind has to catch up with the body going, whoa, what just happened? And then there's a lot of trauma involved in that, there's a lot of mental stress, a lot of anxiety. You're suddenly in a body that doesn't feel familiar, and there just didn't seem to be any support, let alone the type of support that might place value on kind of the psychosocial and give people the tools to come to terms with what had happened, and a safe, supportive environment where people could begin to explore how to navigate some of the challenges that were brought around through treatment and surgery in a safe space, which we talked about, in a space that felt very welcoming, that felt understanding of some of the consequences of treatment people were navigating. And really, I guess, to start Move Dance Feel, it was about uniting people, uniting women so that they didn't feel alone in that. And as mentioned during the presentation, there was an incredibly high statistic, 75% in kind of UK data, talking about 75% of people with negative side effects post-treatment. And what I didn't share is that post-treatment could be 10 years post-treatment. So essentially you don't have cancer anymore, but the side effects are so debilitating that even 5 years, 10 years post-treatment, you still can't really have what we call a decent quality of life. And definitely at that point there was no support, no resources available. And simultaneously, when I discovered that statistic and was very sobered by it and thought, wow, more needs to be done, there was a lot of really compelling evidence around the value of physical activity. And I thought, well, if we know physical activity is beneficial at all stages of cancer treatment for all cancers, why is no one offering dance? Because it's social and expressive as well. And it is a holistic form of physical activity, whilst also having this very strong undercurrent of unity. and the creative aspect, as we know, can support well-being. That's possibly another topic. All the evidence that's coming around well-being in connection to creative pursuits.
Can I ask you about yourself? Are you a professional dancer to start with?
Yeah, I've danced since I was a child, since I was 4. And actually my relationship with dance for my younger years was almost as a hobby. And I guess me being a little different, was never really interested in being a performer on stage, although I did perform as part of my dance experiences when I was younger. It was never super comfortable. I was more interested in the making process and dancing with others rather than dancing as a performer, where the experience became about the audience's experiences more so than my own. So although I danced for many years growing up, I guess I didn't have the aspiration to be a professional dancer. And it was also at that time kind of musical theatre, which also wasn't really my scene. And then I actually went to university and did an undergraduate degree in performing arts more generally. And within that degree, there were undercurrents of the value of arts in education or in community. And there was kind of community and activism, which sparked an interest. And then it was years later I went and did professional training as a postgraduate in my early 20s. And it was through that professional training where I came up with this idea.
Because sometimes when I think about culture, sort of in various situations, in health situations, you talk about singing, choir singing, for example, and what you have mentioned also is that you're interested in the collective. I mean, dancing together with other people. How important is that actually in this situation, dancing on your own or together with others?
I feel it's very important. For me, I would argue that dance is primarily a social art form, and we touched upon it in kind of humans' relationship to dance throughout history and prehistory, and that it's always been a really innate part of human culture and people gathering around a fire. Especially it's very important now, even days, with indigenous communities and how people come together to celebrate, to grieve, to tell stories. And so for me, the social aspect is so very important. I think I also personally get more joy when I dance with others than alone. That's not to say there isn't satisfaction when you can dance alone. And in this context particular, I think when we're looking at the potential of dance to improve health, you have to acknowledge loneliness, and how here we are 2023 almost going into 2024, and we have an epidemic of loneliness. Even when people are even though overpopulated and people are surrounded by others, it's different in the dance setting where there's a sense of connection that's intimate, and there's relatability, and you have presence. You connect with people with your whole body, your whole selves. You're not present without being present in mind, thinking about work or something else. And nowadays I think we miss that. People are sometimes alongside one another but on their phones. They're not really giving you their full attention. They're not fully listening with their whole body. And I actually think loneliness is the root cause of many mental health challenges and other health challenges, and particularly in the context of cancer, rates of loneliness is very common. Became a significant problem through the pandemic. I mean, for everybody, but very much for those who are immunocompromised. And even now, it's cooler weather, and people who have cancer and have a compromised immune system will isolate by choice because they fear for their health. But it means they spend many hours alone, and that causes more suffering.
Yeah. Sometimes I also feel that many people sort of live in other sort of regretting things they didn't do, and also about sort of anxiety for tomorrow. But bringing them into this narrow space of now, do you think that dance can sort of close the door to pain and this type of anxiety and taking over, actually? Is that part of the success story, that you get the relief and distress and whatever?
Very much, and I think it's multiple things at play. I think the fact it can be very joyous, and the way that we dance with Move Dance Feel, we're inviting people into a positive environment, into a positive experience, even though a serious and sad commonality of cancer can bring people together. We are there to dance rather than fixate on the cancer or have a therapeutic intention. It's about really interrogating the creative heart of it. And with that, we know there are multiple studies talking about music as a way to minimize pain. And what you're talking about, absorption, being really present, can also put us with the breath, with the body, with the rhythm, with one another, with the laughter, and again, kind of act as a natural pain relief. There's also something around feeling really present to, you said it, not worrying too much about tomorrow and not distracted by yesterday, but the cognitive workout that dance offers, especially in learning material or improvising, can just bring you to this very present moment now. And that's also a gift in modern day society, where we rarely are in this very moment, to just be here now with this very moment. And there was a wonderful quote or piece of feedback from one of our dancers recently who had joined our community fairly recently, and after the third or fourth session she said, "Oh, I was really in my body today. I felt really present, and I understood for the first time that the quality of what we do today matters more than for how long we're going to be here." And it was such a profound realization, because rarely do we humans now, with our productive ways of life, think about the gift of today. We're always forward focused.
Yeah, because sometimes I also think that that's another sort of part of it, actually. I think is that I remember Louis Armstrong singing about when you're crying, you bring on the rain. That is, that our both happiness and sadness are infectious. How do you try to avoid crying and bringing on the rain in the group, and spreading happiness
well, I think,
is that difficult?
yes and no. I think sorrow and joy go hand in hand, and interestingly, I've been journeying this year a lot with grief. And there's beautiful writings from Francis Weller, who wrote The Wild Edge of Sorrow, who talks a lot about grief and gratitude going hand in hand, and sorrow and joy. And actually, when we can find a way to be comfortable with these simultaneous phenomena, that's to be fully human and fully present and real with one another. So to answer your question, there are undoubtedly tears that come up in this space, and I think actually it's something that we very much welcome. And we talked a bit earlier about creating a safe space, and the tears can be of joy and relief. They can also be because when we move in ways that are creating pockets of space in the body, or particularly focused on relieving tension that people carry in the body, that also relaxes the body enough to release the emotion that people have suppressed. So if people cry in the space, it's quite natural. We always have tissues in the room. We welcome it. We think maybe, finally you're in a space that feels safe enough to let go of these tears. It's actually more damaging to us humans when we have a strong emotion, we push it down, and we have a strong, we push it down. That's what can cause pain and tension and suffering in the body.
Can that also create compassion?
So coming back to that, when we allow tears in the room, there's an element as facilitators where we might be affected, because we have compassionate hearts, and the community, does generate such intimacy. The community genuinely begins to care for one another. So if you see someone a little bit emotional, distressed, but more often than not, honestly, 9 times out of 10, when one of our dancers shows very strong emotion, they say, "Oh, it's crying, but it feels good to cry. It feels good to release." And they might be a little embarrassed, because that's sometimes quite the British culture or Swedish and Western culture.
Our
See me
culture
cry.
as well.
But then we say, but this is part of being human. And actually, I've realized through my journey with grief recently, the more we allow ourselves to drop into the sorrow or welcome the difficult emotions, the more capacity we have to also reach the heights and also touch great joy and pleasure and ecstasy, and someone said it earlier, this aliveness, because we're capacity building and it goes in all dimensions. So when you suppress that part of yourself and numb to the pain and numb to the fear and the worry, you also numb yourself out to feeling pleasure and feeling the good stuff. So we might find that, through the joy and the positivity that we release and help people to move towards in the dance session, Also very supported by the music choices and the movement material that we guide people through. The people's capacity to feel more of the difficult stuff is also there, but it's a cathartic process to move through it, and I think it's a necessary part of being human.
Again, you create so many thoughts and questions, and I was also thinking that, people talk about, you can go out in nature to meditate and so forth, but moving is one thing, but dancing is another thing. Dancing involves choreography and learning, which needs sort of a great deal actually of attention and focus on what you're doing. How much is that involved in your thinking when you plan your dancing? That now we have a little bit of choreography, you have to learn and you have to practice. And that again absorbs you in that, focuses on that problem. Is that part of your thinking actually when you plan this kind of dance sessions?
I think the absorption is innate in dance.
Yeah.
What I think of when I plan choreographic scores is multiple things. To invite people to explore an idea where they develop their movement vocabulary, or the ways in which they can move to open up to new possibilities, acknowledging the space behind, or using the space differently, or moving more animatedly with different body parts. So actually developing them as movers and dancers. So that when we come to some more improvised explorations or freestyle moments, they can feel themselves choose to move in new ways, because they've learned new ways of moving through the taught material, through the choreography. There's something that came up in the research findings around that of challenges, and I would add into that artistic challenges, and for any facilitator to not be nervous about bringing in a challenge, because we all need challenges in life to grow from and with. And so when you look at the research data and people talking about challenges and managing challenges, it's that lever or that's needed to reach a place of accomplishment, what we call artistic mastery. So you do need challenges. Again, if we're too challenged, it's uncomfortable, but if we get the right level of challenge, it can lead to growth and development, again in our movement vocabulary, but in our way of thinking and thinking about ourselves, our self-worth, what we can achieve. And in the context of cancer, many women saying, I'm amazed at what I can do. I thought I was just old and disabled, and now I can dance. And there's also something in that around identity, which we touched upon earlier. One woman thinking, I used to dance so much as a child, liberated. And I think as adults we get too caught up in, I can't dance because there's a way to dance. So we can guide people in a way to dance, and at the same time saying these are just ideas to explore, that then through the exploration you're given the tools of how you could move, but actually what's more exciting is for you to explore and discover for yourself. Everybody who walks, who runs, who bends down to pick up money off the floor, if you're lucky, or socks, can dance. If you can move, you can dance. But there's a fear around moving in a specific way. So we offer that structure to hold people who like to learn how to move. And it also really unifies the group. If we're all moving in the same direction at the same time with the same rhythm, that sense of unity is really palpable. There's pleasure in the synchronicity, which also links to neuroscience, and kind of brain frequencies, the mirror neurons connecting. But there's also such pleasure and joy to rebel and break away from that, and have the structure, but also have the freedom of choice within it, to really learn on an individual level, I really love to move this way, so I'm going to indulge in that. Whereas Goldman really loves to move that way, and he can indulge in that, this freedom. And then we can come back together and unify through this synchronized movement, but then we can break away again. So you're also, in the environment, placing value on the individual within the collective, which is again very reflective of human life. We need to be connected, we need one another to survive, but we also need to be seen as and celebrated as an individual within that.
Because I think that has been proven many times in many studies that moving together rhythmically actually generates generosity and being very pro-social. And I can go on forever, and I was really convinced when you talked about it. Thank you for a wonderful seminar. It was really superb in many ways. Also the presentation, you're very good at that.
Thank you.
But how do we persuade politicians and authorities? Because we need to have this actually integrated into the health, whatever area, working both before and after, both pro-habilitation, rehabilitation. Which are your sort of best arguments to persuade people? And how shall we approach politicians and authorities to integrate that into the sort of basic part of a healing process after cancer or whatever?
I mean, great questions. I think the key word you've used is integration, and for me that's also about collaboration. It's no longer working in our separate silos. You have to find ways to connect and work together and take time to understand one another's working systems and how the working together can complement and enhance one another's working systems. You know, there's no threat of competition, but you need patience to try and bring different sectors and different working models together. A lot of it is advocacy, so having the conversations, keep having the conversations in all settings you're in. I don't know how to reach a politician, and yet if I talk to a neighbour, my neighbour might be friends with one. So keep having the conversations and trust in that kind of grassroots rippling out effect. Where possible, I, as you saw in the seminar, position participants' voice, beneficiaries' voice in the research data. So we're trying to create an argument or persuade people not just through statistical information but through personal stories. Storytelling is also a really strong tool that has been around throughout history that stays with people, the emotive aspect of it. And I think it's patience, like times are changing. I say my 3 P's: passion, you saw I'm hopelessly passionate; perseverance, to keep doing the work, keep advocating for the work, find different ways to advocate through presentation, through social media, through website, through conversations, but patience. And I think the art sector is regularly evolving and expanding, and you know, dance and cancer, you know, I'm exploring new territory. It takes time for people to get their heads around that. You know, dance and cancer, we've not thought about that before. Dance and cancer care, why? And prove its value through the testimonials. But it's also patience that for any significant movement, let's say, of change, those around, in terms of their mindset, have to change with it, have to turn inwards as well. And I do feel the health sector are starting to open their ears and their eyes to other ways of doing things. And I think partly that's because medical students and health professionals are also being diagnosed with cancer, are also struggling with high levels of stress and anxiety, and understanding that they don't want to take a pill to manage their health. I mean, the more health professionals or politicians that say that we could get moving and dancing and actually experiencing the benefits for themselves, the more they'll get it than if they were to read a research report. But trying to get them into the room for a dance experience, you know, we have to get creative with how we can sneakily invite.
Sounds interesting. You have cited more or less Bob Dylan. Times are changing.
Times are changing.
But then let's go to Beatles. Do you know about Beatles?
Let it be.
No, not let it be, but rather blackbirds singing in the dead of night.
Okay.
Are we blackbirds? Because we sing before sunrise.
Interesting. I like that reflection. That's a nice way to
Maybe we are.
I mean,
so there is a sunrise.
What you've just brought in there as well, that I think is a really key note to potentially end on, is imagination. And when we were talking about absorption or the well-being properties, people are becoming, I think, so fed by social media and so overstimulated by the messages we see. We rarely kind of just sit and rest in our imagination. And dance and creativity massively fires that. These conversations feel inspiring because we can imagine a different way of doing things. And I think that is also hopefully coming in, ideally at a political level or a a health level, because we're living in a world where it's calling for us to do things differently. We can't keep doing things the same way. We have to imagine alternatives and move towards that and manifest that, because if it's fruitless to keep going in the same cycles and expecting change. So leaning more into our imagination.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It has been a pleasure, and we are both hoping for the future.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.